Officials at a federal prison in downtown Chicago say they knew they had a problem when they came to work Tuesday and saw a makeshift rope running down the side of the building.
Now we're turning to a massive manhunt this morning for two convicted bank robbers. They staged a daring breakout from a federal prison in Chicago, tying bed sheets together to climb out of a window and make their getaway.
The FBI is offering a $50,000 reward.
The two inmates, who have now been on the run for more than 24 hours, are the first to escape from the federal facility in nearly 20 years.
200 feet above the streets of downtown Chicago, 3 in the morning. Freezing December wind, and two men are dangling from a skyscraper by a rope made of bed sheets. They aren't window washers. They aren't stuntmen. They are convicted bank robbers, and they're hanging by a thread, literally. One slip, 1 week not, one gust of wind whipping between the high rises, and they plummet 17 stories onto solid concrete. What would you risk for freedom? What would you do if you faced 80 years behind bars? Would you bet your life on bed sheets and dental floss? Joseph Banks and Kenneth Conley just did. They spent months smashing through concrete, creating fake prison bars, and braiding thousands of yards of dental floss into the most audacious escape rope in American history. Right now, the guards inside think they're sleeping soundly. They have no idea these two men are gone. This isn't just a prison break. This is the story of desperation, genius, and the terrifying price of freedom. By morning, America will wake up to the impossible. Two men escape from a fortress 17 stories in the sky, and the FBI will launch a manhunt for ghosts who walked through walls. But here's what nobody knew then. One of these men would later describe this escape as a suicidal nightmare, a desperate gamble that nearly killed them both. Before we dive into this unbelievable true story, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a like on this video. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from. Because what happened in Chicago changed prison security forever. And you need to hear how they did it. Welcome to Shadow Case Files. Let's begin. Who is Joseph Banks?
Banks, on the other hand, is one of the most accomplished thieves in the city's history, suspected in at least 20 heists. A Banks surveillance video showed him pulling off one of them in 2008. He was convicted in 2 of the cases, plus 2 other holdups just last week. As he left court, Banks told federal judge Rebecca Paulmeyer, quote, "You'll hear from me," unquote.
Measures have been taken by both the United States Marshal Service and by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to ensure the safety of those individuals threatened.
Joseph Banks wasn't your typical bank robber. He was smart, calculated, and almost impossible to catch. The FBI called him the second-hand bandit. Why? Because Banks wore disguises purchased from thrift stores during every robbery. Wigs, fake beards, cheap suits that made him blend into any crowd. After each heist, he'd dump the clothes and disappear. No consistent description, no pattern, just a ghost who walked into banks and walked out with cash. Between 2009 and 2011, Banks was suspected in 21 bank robberies.
Banks, on the other hand, is one of the most
he was eventually
accomplished thieves
convicted
in the city's
of just
history,
4.
suspected
2 successful,
in at least 20
2
heists.
attempted. But those
Banks'
4
surveillance
robberies
video
netted
showed him
nearly
pulling off one of them
$600,000.
in 2008.
And here's the detail
He
that
was
matters.
convicted in
Over $540,000 was never recovered. Banks hid it, and when he was arrested, he wouldn't tell anyone where. By December 2012, Banks was standing trial in Chicago. He was 37 years old, facing 80 years in federal prison, a life sentence. But Banks had other plans. He fired his lawyers and represented himself. He claimed to be a Moorish national, a sovereign citizen who didn't recognize U.S. laws. It was chaos. He was so disruptive during the trial that federal marshals had to physically strap him into a restraint chair just to keep him in the courtroom. The jury didn't buy it. On December 13th, 2012, they found him guilty. When the verdict was read, Banks did something chilling. He looked directly at the judge, Rebecca Paulmeyer, and told her he would be seeking retribution. Then he added these exact words, "No motion will be filed, but you'll hear from me." 5 days later, Judge Paulmeyer would hear from him, but not in the way anyone expected. The cellmate. Banks wasn't alone in his cell. He shared the tiny space with Kenneth Conley, a 38-year-old from Tinley Park, Illinois.
Conley had been in prison since October of last year for one suburban bank stick-up, the proceeds from which he showered on a local strip club, where he also reportedly bragged of plans to move to Bermuda.
Conley was a former strip club manager who'd recently pleaded guilty to robbing $4,000 from a bank. He'd walked in wearing a coat and tie with a gun tucked in his waistband. Professional on the outside, desperate on the inside, Conley was facing up to 20 years in federal prison. Not as much as Banks, but enough to destroy his life. Two men, one tiny cell, both staring down decades behind bars, both with nothing left to lose. And one of them had over $500,000 waiting somewhere on the outside. That's when the planning began. The inescapable prison. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago isn't like other prisons. It's not surrounded by fences and guard towers. It's a 27-story triangular skyscraper sitting right in the heart of downtown. Built in 1975, it was designed to be escape-proof. The windows aren't traditional bars. They're narrow slits, 5 inches wide. That's smaller than the width of a human head. The architects believed if you can't fit through the window, you can't escape. For 30 years, that theory held true. Nobody had ever escaped from the MCC Chicago. Banks and Conley were housed on the 17th floor, 170 feet above the street. The window in their cell was just like all the others. 5 inches wide, steel reinforced, embedded in concrete, impossible to escape through, unless you make it bigger. That's exactly what they decided to do. Can you imagine planning something this dangerous while locked in a cell the size of a bathroom? The patience it would take, the fear of getting caught. Every single day, knowing one mistake means solitary confinement or worse. Drop a comment below. What would you be thinking if you were in that cell? And tell me where you're watching from. Now let's talk about how they pulled off the impossible. The plan.
This morning, a massive manhunt is underway in Illinois for two cellmates who plotted and pulled off a brazen escape like something out of the movies. Just like in The Rock, the FBI says the duo tied up bed sheets into a rope. In this real escape, they added a makeshift harness to scale down this towering federal penitentiary in downtown Chicago.
Now, I don't understand how they did it because the security over here is always crazy, in and out. But they gave it a lot of thought.
According to court documents, Joseph Jose Banks and Kenneth Connolly were last seen locked up Monday at 10 p.m. during a head count. It's then authorities believe the two stuffed their beds with clothes in the shapes of bodies, broke the window shimmying out of a hole only inches wide, then scaled down the side of the building, reportedly 20 stories up. At 7 the next morning, as employees arrived at work, they noticed the sheets still dangling from the building. Connolly and Banks were missing.
Breaking out required 4 things: tools, camouflage, a rope, and time. First, they needed to break through concrete. But you don't get a sledgehammer in federal prison. So they improvised. Investigators believe they smuggled heavy metal parts back to their cell. Maybe from a floor buffer machine. Maybe from gym equipment. Nobody knows for sure. But they turned those parts into makeshift chisels and hammers. Then they started smashing the cinder block wall around the window frame. Think about that for a second. Every strike echoes. Every chip of concrete risks discovery. They had to time their work with the noise of the prison. Food carts rattling, doors slamming, anything loud enough to cover the sound of metal hitting stone. And all that debris, they flushed it down the toilet, bit by bit, day after day, for weeks. But here's the genius part. They couldn't leave a gaping hole in the wall. Guards would notice immediately, so they created camouflage. They pulverized concrete dust and mixed it with soap and toothpaste. The paste matched the color of the wall perfectly. Every day, after chipping away at the concrete, they'd cover their progress. Eventually, they removed an entire cinder block. They loosened the steel security bars, but they still had a problem. If a guard looked closely, they'd see the bars were missing. So Banks and Conley created fake bars. Using cardboard from toilet paper rolls, they crafted replicas and painted them to look like metal. From a distance, the window looked completely secure. The real steel bars? They shoved them deep inside their mattresses. Now they needed a rope, a 200-foot rope to descend 17 stories. They started hoarding bed sheets. But prison bed sheets are thin. They knew the sheets alone wouldn't hold 2 grown men. So they collected dental floss, thousands of yards of it, and they braided the floss into the bed sheets, reinforcing every inch. Dental floss is incredibly strong when braided. It turned a collection of sheets into a lifeline. They even fashioned harnesses so they could descend safely. And there's one more detail. Both men started dieting. They needed to lose weight to squeeze through the narrow opening they'd created. Everything was ready. The clock was ticking. It was time. The escape night. Monday, December 17th, 2012. 10 p.m. The guard conducted their routine head count. Banks and Conley were both present. The guards marked them down and moved on. As soon as the tier went quiet, Banks and Conley got to work. They created decoys. Using clothes and extra sheets, they molded shapes under their blankets that looked like sleeping bodies. If a guard shined a flashlight into the cell during the night, it would look like they were there. Then they removed the fake bars and the loosened cinder block. The hole was just big enough to squeeze through. Barely. They secured the bedsheet rope to the window frame. They checked every knot. Their lives depended on it. It was freezing outside. December in Chicago. The wind at that altitude was brutal. They changed out of their orange jumpsuits into street clothes they'd hidden. Around 2:40 in the morning, one of them squeezed through the opening. Then the other. Imagine the terror. Standing on a tiny ledge 17 stories above concrete, about to trust your life to bed sheets. They threw the rope over the side. It cascaded down the wall into darkness. They slipped into their harnesses, and they began to descend. Banks would later write about this moment in a letter from prison. He called it a horrific, unimaginable nightmare, a suicidal one. He wrote about losing his grip and catching it at intervals, his legs giving out, his hands going numb. This wasn't a smooth Hollywood rappel. This was desperation. The friction was so intense that when FBI recovered the rope later, it was stained with blood. Their hands were raw and torn. They had to move quickly but carefully. If the rope swung too much, they'd smash into the building. If their grip failed, they were dead. It took several agonizing minutes. Minutes where they were completely exposed. If anyone walking on the street had looked up, they would have seen two men scaling down a federal prison. But nobody looked up. At approximately 2:40 a.m., Joseph Banks and Kenneth Conley touched down on the pavement. They were free. And here's the part that sounds like a movie. They didn't have a getaway car. So they did what anyone in downtown Chicago does when they need a ride. They hailed a taxi. The cab driver picked them up, completely unaware he was now the getaway driver for the most high-profile escapees in the country. They paid cash, and they vanished. Back at the MCC, everything was quiet. At 3:30 a.m., a guard conducted another head count. He walked past their cell, saw the shapes in the bunks, and moved on. The security camera that should have recorded the area where they descended, it was malfunctioning. Hours passed. 4 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m. Around 7 in the morning, employees started arriving for work. One of them looked up at the building and froze. Dangling down the side of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, blowing in the morning wind, was a long knotted rope made of bed sheets. The prison went into lockdown. Guards rushed to the 17th floor. They ripped the blankets off the bunks. No emuts. They looked at the window. A gaping hole in the concrete. Joseph Banks and Kenneth Conley were gone. They had at least a 4-hour head start. The manhunt. The news exploded. This wasn't just a prison break. This was a humiliation for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The FBI took over immediately. A $50,000 reward was offered, and there was fear, real fear. Banks had threatened the judge. Federal agents were assigned to protect Judge Paul Meyer and the prosecutors. Nobody knew if Banks had escaped to run or to seek revenge. The manhunt was massive. Heavily armed federal agents and police swarmed Chicago. There was a reported sighting at the Greyhound bus station. A SWAT team descended. They found nothing. Then investigators caught a break. They traced the taxi ride south to Tinley Park, where Conley had family connections. Kenneth Conley made a critical mistake. He went straight to his mother's house. Hours after escaping federal prison, he showed up on her doorstep. His mother was stunned, and she made the hardest decision of her life. She turned her own son away. She refused to help him. The FBI surrounded the neighborhood. Police dogs picked up the scent and followed it to a nearby train station in New Lenox. The trail went cold on the platform. Authorities believed they'd boarded a commuter train. The city was on edge. Speculation ran wild. Were they heading for some tropical island to live off banks' hidden money? But the reality of being a fugitive is nothing like the fantasy. It's stressful, paranoid, and usually very short. Banks and Conley knew they couldn't stay together. They split up. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to ask you something. Could you imagine being that mother? Turning away your own child because it's the right thing to do? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And please, subscribe to Shadow Case Files for more incredible true stories like this.
Now to some breaking news now from overnight. Joseph Jose Banks, who escaped from jail in the Loop, has now been captured. It happened around 11:30 in the 2300 block of North Bosworth in Chicago. ABC 7's Diane Patthew joins us live with what we've been learning in just the last few hours. Diane?
Jose, good morning to you. Yes, FBI authorities confirmed to us that last night they did capture Joseph Jose Banks here in the 2300 block of North Bosworth. He did not have any kind of weapons on him, and he came with them without incident. Banks and Kenneth Conley, you'll remember, are the inmates that escaped from Chicago's Metropolitan Correctional Center downtown early Tuesday by apparently squeezing and smashing a hole in a wall at the bottom of a narrow cell. They squeezed through that narrow hole, then scaled down 17 stories using a makeshift rope that they made from bed sheets. After fleeing the city, the two men were actually spotted first in Tinley Park. A neighbor there said that Conley was armed. Authorities searched that area thoroughly. They didn't find either of the men. Then late last night, the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force and Chicago police captured 37-year-old Banks. The FBI calls him one of Chicago's most prolific bank robbers ever. We should also mention Conley is still on the loose.
The captures. Joseph Banks didn't run far. He stayed in Chicago, heading back to the north side. On the night of Thursday, December 20th, just 2 days after the escape, the FBI received a tip. They tracked Banks to Lincoln Park, an upscale neighborhood. Around 11:30 p.m., officers surrounded an apartment building. They moved in fast. Banks was caught completely by surprise. He was arrested without incident. When they searched him, there was no sign of the missing $540,000. His impossible escape had bought him less than 3 days of freedom. But Kenneth Conley was still out there, and he was proving much harder to find. Days turned into weeks. Christmas came and went. New Year passed. The nationwide manhunt continued. Conley had decided to hide in plain sight. He was staying in Palos Hills, another suburb southwest of Chicago. On January 4th, 2013, 17 days after the escape, police responded to a report of suspicious activity. Someone trying apartment doors, looking for one unlocked. When officers arrived, they saw an old man. Heavy overcoat, beret, leaning on a cane. He looked frail and harmless, but something seemed off. As they got closer, they realized it was a disguise.
Second bank robber who escaped from a Chicago prison last month is due in federal court this morning. Authorities say Kenneth Conley tried to elude authorities by disguising himself as an old man.
Good morning to you, Stacey. And yes, Kenneth Conley was found wearing an overcoat, beret, glasses, walking with a limp. Police swarmed the apartment complex where he was found in. After a short scuffle, he was finally captured and is now back behind bars.
Maintenance crews in this apartment complex called police because they suspected a man was staying in the basement of one of the buildings. A short time later, police confronted a man they say was acting suspiciously.
The guy could not provide any identification. So while the officer was trying to determine who he was, he punched the officer, knocked him down, and ran.
The officers caught 38-year-old Conley a block away as he tried to break into another building. After a struggle, they took him into custody and noticed he was carrying a weapon that turned out to be a BB gun. Conley was awaiting sentencing for bank robbery when he and cellmate Joseph Jose Banks made a daring escape down a makeshift rope ladder from 15 stories up at the Metropolitan Correction Center.
It was Kenneth Conley. When Conley realized he was caught, he ran. He fought. He allegedly assaulted a federal agent. Officers had to use a taser to subdue him. When they confirmed his identity, Conley looked at the agents and said something chilling. It happened once. What makes you think it won't happen again? Defiant, to the very end. The Bedsheet Breakout was over. Justice and aftermath. The escape sent shockwaves through the federal prison system. The investigation pointed to one thing: complacency. The staff at MCC Chicago never believed an escape from the 17th floor was possible, so they stopped looking for signs. Changes came quickly. The windows were reinforced with heavy steel plating, and a new national policy was created. It's called the bar tap. Now guards in federal high-rise prisons must regularly go into cells and physically strike the window bars with a mallet. They're checking to make sure the bars are real and intact. As for the escapees, the courts showed no mercy. In 2014, Joseph Banks stood before Judge Paul Meyer again. He apologized. He called the escape an act of desperation. He admitted his sovereign citizen defense was all fake. The judge wasn't moved. She called him narcissistic and a threat to society. Joseph Banks was sentenced to 36 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay $589,000 in restitution. The vast majority of that money has never been recovered. He's currently housed at a high-security penitentiary in West Virginia. Kenneth Conley faced 2 sentencings. First, for the bank robbery. The judge gave him the maximum, 20 years. The escape was cited as the key reason. Then Conley faced sentencing for the escape itself. He smirked through the hearing. He even winked at the federal agents who'd arrested him. The judge called him incorrigible and sentenced him to an additional 3.5 years. Conley exploded. He yelled profanities at the judge, told him exactly where he could put his sentence. The judge simply replied, "Thank you." Kenneth Conley is currently incarcerated in Illinois. Joseph Banks later wrote about the escape from his prison cell. He described it as a suicidal nightmare. He talked about the terror of hanging from bed sheets in the freezing darkness, losing his grip, his legs giving out, the wind swinging him against concrete. This wasn't Hollywood. This was real, and it nearly killed them both. Kenneth Conley's mother had to turn her own son away. Imagine that choice. The pain of knowing your child is desperate and refusing to help because you know it's wrong. Banks got less than 3 days of freedom. Conley got 17. Both added decades to their sentences. Both are still locked up today. Was it worth it? Was 3 days of terror worth the years they added to their lives behind bars? The missing money was never found. Banks still won't say where it is. Maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe it's buried somewhere, waiting. We'll probably never know. But here's what we do know. When people face life behind bars, desperation drives them to attempt the impossible. Banks and Conley proved that with enough patience, ingenuity, and reckless courage, even the impossible becomes possible. But freedom was always an illusion. They were always going to be caught, and the price they paid was enormous. Their escape changed federal prison security forever. It exposed weaknesses. It forced reforms. And it reminded us that human beings will risk everything when they have nothing left to lose. This escape was incredible. The planning, the execution, the sheer audacity of rappelling down a skyscraper on bed sheets. But ultimately, it was a tragedy born from desperation. What do you think? Were Banks and Conley brilliant or just desperate? Was their escape worth the price they paid? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who belongs in the Shadow Case Files community. Hit that subscribe button. Smash the like button. Share this video with someone who loves true crime. Because these stories matter. They teach us about human nature, about consequences, and about the lengths people will go for freedom. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next case. This is Shadow Case Files. Until next time.